So section 4, Rise of Europe, part 2, what are the basic ideas of communism? So communism is developed by this guy named Karl Marx, who was interesting because he was basically a historian of the economy. And Marx thought that we could engage in a scientific understanding of history. He was trying to discover the laws that govern history, like a scientist would discover the laws that govern gravity. And he argued that essentially what drove history was the economy. He thought that societies progressed through economic stages, and what made one stage differ from another was a different kind of class conflict. So for him, there were economic problems that drove conflict between different economic classes, and that all humanity's problems came out of that conflict, which was based on economic inequality. So Marx thought, if we can resolve this problem of economic inequality, we won't have more problems. But basically, in this class conflict, he thought there were two classes, an oppressor class and an oppressed class. So it was very clear, there's good guys and there's bad guys. The good guys are the oppressed, the bad guys are the oppressors. What makes you the oppressor is that you own the capital, the means of production. The oppressed are the people who don't own the capital, the means of production. So in the economic stage of slavery, the oppressors owned the means of production, which were slaves, other people, and the oppressed were the slaves. In feudalism, the oppressors were the lords who owned the land, and the oppressed were the peasants who had to work the land for the lords. In capitalism, the oppressors were the factory owners, the capitalists. The means of production were the machines, and the workers, the oppressed, were the ones who were forced to work on those machines. So Marx saw this idea that we have these different, like I said, each stage is marked by a different kind of class conflict. The oppressors own the means of production, the slaves, the land, or the machines, and the oppressed are the ones who don't own them. Now, in many ways, this was popular because it explained very neatly and simply the problems that people faced in the 19th century, especially the poorer people. But also what made it even more popular was Marx predicted that eventually class conflict would lead to communism, where there was no more class conflict, right? So he predicted that there would eventually be a revolution that would bring communism where everything would be perfect. So what does this communist utopia look like? Well, there would essentially be no private property. Now, I don't mean that you wouldn't have your own toothbrush, but I mean is you would not own, for example, a whole bunch of land. You wouldn't own the machines. They would all be shared evenly. And here's the thing that's great. So everyone would get enough stuff, basically. Well, if everyone has enough stuff, there'll be no more conflict, right? Remember, Marx thought that basically all human conflict, all human problems arose out of economic issues, economic inequality. So once we solve that, do we really need a government? From Marx's perspective, governments just existed to take care of the class interests of the oppressors. And if we all get along, if we don't have more conflict, there won't be more theft, for example. We don't need a government anymore. There's no more government to exploit you, to take away your freedom. So Marx did not predict that communism would lead to an all-powerful government. That's not what Marx wanted. Marx predicted that communism would lead to no government, but instead of having anarchy and chaos, because everyone had enough stuff, because we all shared our goods evenly, you would not only have enough stuff, you would enjoy perfect freedom. So you can see why this would be attractive. Marx diagnosed the problem and then came up with a solution and a goal that is very, who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want enough stuff and the freedom to enjoy it? Now, Marx predicted that workers would be pushed so far by the capitalist social profits that they would rebel. That's what he thought would happen. And he predicted it would happen in the industrialized countries first because they were the ones pushing the workers the hardest. So he thought it would happen first in Britain. It didn't. It happened first in Russia. But he did. That's what he thought. But that's not a big problem for Marxists because they argue that they're scientific, so they would just change their theories based on data. Now, here's the thing, though. The communist revolution Marx predicted would necessarily be violent. Right? I love this cartoon. It shows how communists saw the world. The rich people are in charge, and they are supported by all the poor people. The rich people control the government, and they control religion to try and trick people into just accepting their terrible lives in hopes that heaven will be better. And if you try and oppose them, the army will shoot at you. So these rich people are willing to use violence, so naturally the workers are entitled to use violence themselves because they're doing it for the right reasons. So all means are acceptable. The revolution is going to be violent. And one thing I want to stress, even though Marx, as we'll see, will be wrong about a lot of stuff, his development of a party, of an organization to bring about revolution, is itself going to make revolution possible. Right? So the communists, even though they're only a small number of people initially, are able to organize effectively and often seize control and establish communism. Now, it's important. This may sound very theoretical, and you may say, why are we talking about this? It's something we have to understand now, and it'll be very important later. So how did nationalism and communism conflict with each other? Well, remember, in communism, what defines you is your class, right? Marx said that the history is basically the history of class conflict, so what matters is not whether you're French or British or German or Indian or African or whatever. What's most important is your class, whether you're a worker or whether you're a capitalist. Therefore, according to communism, French workers have more in common with British workers than they would with French factory owners, right? Even though the French and the British workers don't have a common language and maybe couldn't even understand each other, from a communist perspective, their interests are the same, and those workers should unite together, as shown in this very lovely image, all these workers holding hands. In nationalism, though, the idea is that your nation is your first loyalty, and that's more important than your class. So you and I may be of different religions, we might speak different languages, but we're all Americans. That's what comes first. So therefore, according to nationalism, French workers have more in common with French factory owners than British workers. It doesn't matter that one's from one class and one's from another class. What matters is that they're all British or they're all French or whatever. So continuing on with section 4, question 15. Why did the attempt by the Frankfurt Assembly to unite Germany fail? What succeeded? What role did Otto von Bismarck play in that unification? What sort of government did Germany fail? So in 1848, there were all these liberal revolutions. And I hate that I'm going to talk about 1848 enough, but there's all these revolutions trying to bring liberal governments to Europe. And many people, many Germans, hope that they will have a unified Germany. At this point, there's a German ethnicity, there's German people, but there's no single Germany. And it's their hope that this revolution will allow for the development of a single Germany. And as liberals will do, they gather together to talk, to try and figure out a way through compromise to establish a single unified Germany. They did this in the Frankfurt Assembly, which is called that because they assembled in the city of Frankfurt in what is modern-day Germany. This fails. They're not able to do this. Basically, all Germans agreed that Germany should be unified, but they wanted it done on their own terms. Right? They wanted it done on their own terms. They wanted to be the ones in charge of Germany. So everyone would agree, hey, we should all unify, all Germans should be together, but each one thought that their part of the future Germany should be in charge. So this fails. Otto von Bismarck, who was very conservative and pro-monarchy, he thought you needed a strong leader to hold society together. He didn't accept all this liberalism stuff. He thought this was not the way to unify Germany. He said Germany has to be unified through blood and iron, right? Meaning war. So he thought you needed a strong leader to unite Germany, the German nation, into a powerful nation state. And doesn't this sound like someone's ideas we're going to talk about later during World War II? I think it does. So that's why we're talking about this, and that's why we talked about the relationship between nationalism and communism. But in any case, Bismarck is pro-monarchy. You need a strong leader to hold society together, and a strong leader to unite the German nation to a powerful nation state. How are you going to do that? Through war. So he is going to be really good at starting wars and winning them. Otto von Bismarck will provoke a war against the Austrian Empire to gain control of territory that's inhabited mostly by Germans, ethnic Germans. He will then provoke a war with France by using public opinion in a newspaper and win that war. That's the part that they fight about is actually where my ancestors are from, a place called Alsace-Lorraine, which is, even though it was part of France at this time, a lot of German people lived there. So that's why he wanted it. He's going to win in part thanks to carefully planned railroad schedules. So they're using industrial warfare very well. And the success in these wars is going to allow King William I to be declared Kaiser of the Second German Empire. And so the key thing here, this is, if Germany would have been unified through liberalism, Germany would have become a more liberal country. However, Germany is not unified through liberalism. It's unified by the military, meaning military values are going to be more important in Germany because that's what seems to work. So very important for later on. What were the characteristics of the struggle for women's suffrage? We focused on Britain because we talk a lot about Britain in this class, and I thought that would make sense. They're the most similar to the United States in many ways, but they're also different, so it allows them for some comparison. But we had this basic question. Once you start talking about all men are created equal, it's logical for women to say, well, why not us? Why don't we get to be equal too? And of course, nationalism just makes this question even stronger. Remember, nationalism, you have this idea that everyone should be working together. All members of the nation should be working together for the benefit of the nation. You're no longer a passive subject, you're an active citizen who's supposed to be active, doing stuff. Well, shouldn't women also be helping the nation? I mean, if women don't have political rights, doesn't that mean we're only using half of our nation? Shouldn't we use all people to make our nation better? So more and more women are like, we're members of this nation too, we're just as British as men are, we should also have the right to vote. This leads to the women's suffrage movement. And their movement is peaceful at first, but what they see is very just demands, and I think we would agree that women should also have the right to vote, because their government consistently ignores them for reasons that they don't accept. Some of the more radical ones will turn to violence. They'll start doing things like throwing bricks, some start some fires. Violence against property, though, not against people. And in return, the government will respond with violence. It'll throw these women in jail. Even though they're in trouble for political crimes, they will be put in with murderers and thieves and things like that. Some of them will do things like go on hunger strikes, and they'll be force-fed in this really terrifying kind of image. And so things are not going well. But then in World War I, the whole nation needs to be mobilized to fight the war. And the government basically says to these women, these radical women's suffrage movement people, look, we're trying to fight a war for the good of the nation. Can you stop with the protest and with all these other things? Can you stop? And then we'll talk about this after the war's over. And the women say, yeah, we will. We'll stop. And rather than resisting the government, they support the government during this time period, during World War I, when the country's really in need. And at the end of World War I, a lot of people changed their minds. A lot of people who said women should not have the right to vote changed their minds and say, well, look, women are part of the nation. They sacrificed for their country. A lot of women actually died in World War I because they were working in factories making bombs and things like that, and they'll sometimes explode prematurely. So what ends up happening is, because of nationalism, women are going to get the right to vote, because more and more people say, okay, yeah, women are great. They're part of the nation. They contribute to the nation. There's no reason why they should not have the right to vote. So World War I and the rise of nationalism eventually gets women the right to vote in Britain. How did the opportunities available to women transform during the 19th century, as seen in the lives of Mary Seacole and Elizabeth Anderson? So remember, Mary Seacole was a biracial woman who wanted to become a nurse working the Crimean War. However, she didn't fit the image, in part probably because she was biracial, of what the Florence Nightingale and other nurses wanted to project of their profession, and so she was rejected from doing this. There she was of half Scottish, half Jamaican African descent. So she just is going to go anyway and establishes what's called the British Hotel. And the British Hotel basically is literally a hotel where soldiers can stay when they're on leave, and also where she serves delicious food and alcohol and things like that. But what she does is she takes the profits and uses that money to buy medicine and food to give wounded soldiers. The British did not have as most armies at this time, did not have good medical services. So a lot of soldiers who were wounded would die because they didn't receive adequate care, and she treated those people for free. So again, and she was popular among many soldiers because she did this. And so people could look at her and say, why don't we allow women to have a greater position in society? This woman is not acting to benefit herself. She's acting to help our nation. She's acting to help our troops, support the troops. So, and what's interesting, she's able to do this in part by acting in a traditional gender role. She acts as a nurse. It's easy for people to accept women as nurses because women are mothers and wives who take care of husbands and kids when they're sick. So she accepts kind of tradition, but that gets her kind of her foot in the door, but then she builds up a step because she shows that women can also manage things. Women don't need to simply be told what to do. Not only is she a nurse, but remember, she's able to act as a nurse because she's able to make money. Right? She's able to make a profit, and she uses that profit to help soldiers who are wounded. And I say revolution or evolution because you can kind of see the steps, right? She's doing this. Mary Seacole is doing all this stuff like when she's in the 1850s, when Elizabeth Anderson would have been a teenager. So Mary Seacole is expanding the sphere in which women can work, which allows Elizabeth Anderson to go even further. Right? So Elizabeth Anderson had this very strong interest in women's rights and women's suffrage. She's very clever. She becomes a nurse and then uses the knowledge she gains from being a nurse and from stealing body parts. You may remember that. She stole body parts and then would dissect them in a room at night. She gets a medical knowledge, passes exams, exploits legal loopholes to obtain a medical education, and then to practice medicine. And then similar to similar to Mary Seacole, she uses her skills to benefit society. She opens like a little clinic, what's called a dispensary, that will eventually become a hospital to serve especially women and children. And during a cholera epidemic, she will end up treating a lot of people for free. She'll give poor people free medicine and free medical treatment. That, of course, makes her very popular and proves that women can become doctors. And so more and more people are like, well, yeah, I guess women can be doctors. Incidentally, even though she doesn't have the right to vote, she will later become a mayor, which is kind of an interest. She was very good at exploiting legal loopholes. So these are these step-by-step changes.